The spy who infiltrated the SS and survived, August 19, 1943, Bern, Switzerland. A short, nervous German man walked through the streets carrying a diplomatic pouch. Fritz Kolbe was 42 years old. Height, 5 feet 7 inches. Build, athletic despite his age. Occupation, diplomatic courier for the German Foreign Ministry. Inside his pouch, routine diplomatic correspondence. Inside his jacket, 186 photocopied documents stolen from the heart of Nazi Germany. Documents that could end the war, documents that could get him executed. Fritz had crossed the border from Germany into Switzerland that morning. Nobody had searched him. Diplomatic immunity protected couriers. Now he stood outside the British embassy. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear of what he was about to do, but from excitement. Finally, after 2 years of watching Nazi crimes from inside Hitler's government, he could act, he could fight back. He walked into the British embassy and asked to speak with someone from intelligence. 30 minutes later, he walked out, rejected. The British thought he was a German plant, a trap. Too good to be true. They sent him away. Fritz stood on the street, stunned. He'd risked everything. His life, his family, his future. He'd stolen documents from Karl Ritter's desk, documents marked Geheime Reichssache, secret state matter. Documents describing V-weapon development, military deployments, diplomatic communications with Japan. And the British had rejected him. He had one more option. The Americans. Fritz found a phone and called a contact, Ernst Kocherthaler, a German businessman who opposed the Nazis. "Can you get me a meeting with American intelligence?" Kocherthaler hesitated. The Americans were new to espionage, inexperienced, but they might be more willing to take risks than the cautious British. "I'll try," Kocherthaler said. 2 days later, Fritz Kolbe sat across from Alan Dulles, head of OSS operations in Switzerland. Dulles looked at the short German with skepticism. Every intelligence officer's nightmare. A walk-in volunteer offering incredible intelligence. Usually it was a trap. Usually the volunteer was working for the enemy. Dulles had been warned by British intelligence, "Don't trust any Germans. They're all Nazi plants trying to feed you disinformation." Fritz slid a folder across the table. "These are copies of documents I photographed in Berlin, from the Foreign Ministry. I can bring you more. Many more, every time I travel as a courier." Dulles opened the folder. His expression didn't change, but his pulse quickened. These documents were real. Technical details about German military operations that couldn't be faked. Diplomatic cables from neutral countries. Intelligence assessments marked with security classifications. If this was fake, it was the most elaborate fake Dulles had ever seen. Fritz spoke quietly. "I don't want money. I don't want asylum. I don't want anything except to help destroy Hitler's government. I've worked for the Foreign Ministry since before the Nazis took power. I've watched them corrupt everything Germany stood for. I've seen the cables describing the Holocaust in Hungary. I've read reports about the death camps. I can't be complicit anymore. So I'm giving you everything I can access." Dulles made a decision. "We'll call you George Wood. That's your code name. How often can you return to Bern?" Fritz smiled for the first time. "Every few weeks, as often as they send me with the diplomatic pouch." Dulles assigned him an intelligence officer as handler. Gerald Meyer would coordinate the meetings, develop the protocols, ensure Fritz's security. Fritz left the meeting and returned to his hotel. Tomorrow he'd travel back to Berlin, back into the heart of Nazi Germany, back to his job photocopying secret documents after hours. For the next 2 years, Fritz Kolbe would be America's most important spy in Europe. He would deliver 1,600 classified documents, He would provide intelligence that shortened the war, and he would survive. Because nobody, not the Gestapo, not the SS, not even most of his colleagues, ever suspected the quiet diplomat was betraying the Third Reich. Stakes: the fortress with no doors. The problem with spying on Nazi Germany wasn't getting intelligence, it was getting an agent inside. By 1943, Germany was a police state perfected to nightmarish efficiency. The Gestapo had eyes everywhere. Block wardens monitored every neighborhood. Informants infiltrated every workplace. Casual conversations about the war could lead to arrest. Criticism of Hitler meant execution. Listening to foreign radio broadcasts, punishable by death. Sharing information with foreigners, punishable by death. Defeatist comments about German military prospects, punishable by death. In 1942, Germany had 56 offences punishable by death. Before the war, only 3. The terror was systematic, comprehensive, inescapable. OSS planners studied the problem from every angle. Could an American agent infiltrate Germany? No. Language would give them away immediately. German has regional dialects so distinct that a Bavarian sounds foreign in Berlin. An American speaking German, no matter how fluent, would be identified as non-native within minutes. Could a German-American infiltrate? Maybe. But the risk was extraordinary. German counterintelligence was sophisticated. They'd check backgrounds, verify papers, interview references. One inconsistency, and the agent would be arrested, tortured, executed. British intelligence had reached the same conclusion. Penetrating Nazi Germany was effectively impossible. The Gestapo was too efficient. The population was too controlled. The penalties for resistance were too severe. France had resistance networks because France was occupied territory. Occupied populations hated their occupiers. They sheltered Allied agents, provided safe houses, passed information. But Germany? Germans were told they were the master race. They were told the war was existential. Either Germany won or Germany would be destroyed. Most believed it. Those who didn't believe it were too terrified to act. The December 1944 surprise offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, proved the intelligence problem. Allied commanders were completely blindsided. Germany moved 200,000 troops into position for the attack. Allied intelligence detected nothing, no warning, no advance indication. Why? Because the Allies had no human intelligence sources inside Germany, no agents, no networks, no informants. They were fighting blind. OSS desperately needed sources inside the Reich. They needed someone with access to German military planning, someone with access to diplomatic communications, someone who could photograph documents and smuggle them to Switzerland, someone who wouldn't be suspected, someone who could travel freely across borders without searches, someone who had the courage to commit treason, knowing the penalty was torture and execution. Finding such a person seemed impossible. Then Fritz Kolbe walked into Alan Dulles' office carrying 186 stolen documents. The fortress with no doors had just opened. The man who hated Nazis, Fritz Kolbe, was an unlikely spy. Born September 25, 1900, in Berlin. Working-class family. Father, saddlemaker. Mother, died when Fritz was young. Fritz grew up in Imperial Germany. He saw the senseless slaughter of World War I, conscripted in 1917 at age 17, assigned to telegraph units and engineer battalions. Never saw front-line combat. The war ended before his unit deployed. But he saw enough. Saw young men coming back shattered. Saw the casualties, the wounded, the dead. Saw what nationalism and militarism produced. Fritz concluded that patriotism, my country right or wrong, was a devil's philosophy. It killed individual conscience. It made people complicit in crimes. After the war, Fritz joined the Wandervogel movement, a German youth movement focused on nature, hiking, physical fitness. Wandervogel rejected militarism and nationalism. They valued individual development over state loyalty. This wasn't political radicalism. It was cultural resistance to the very things that would later define Nazism. Fritz worked for the German state railways after the war, became the youngest station master at age 22. But he wanted more. He studied economics at the University of Berlin, passed the Foreign Service examinations, joined the German Foreign Ministry in 1925. This was before the Nazis. The Foreign Ministry was professional, apolitical, competent. Fritz served in diplomatic posts in Madrid and Cape Town. In Cape Town, he witnessed South African apartheid, saw how racial ideology corrupted a society, saw how master race thinking justified cruelty. When the Nazis took power in 1933, Fritz recognized the pattern immediately. Same racial ideology, same contempt for human dignity, same glorification of violence. He refused to join the Nazi Party. This wasn't passive resistance, it was career suicide. By the late 1930s, party membership was essentially mandatory for advancement. Refusing to join marked you as politically unreliable. But Fritz wouldn't do it. His supervisor, Rudolf Leutner, repeatedly pressured him. Join the party. You're energetic, competent. The Nazis want men like you. Fritz always refused. The consequences were immediate. No promotions, no prestigious postings. When World War II started in 1939, Fritz was recalled from Cape Town to Berlin, assigned to low-level clerical work, sorting files, preparing routine correspondence, work far below his abilities, punishment for his refusal to embrace Nazism. But this punishment gave Fritz access to files, access to cables, access to secrets. In November 1941, Fritz was assigned to work for Karl Ritter. Ritter served as liaison between the Foreign Ministry and the Military High Command. Every significant military communication passed through Ritter's office. Deployment orders, strategic assessments, intelligence reports. Fritz read them all, and he was horrified. Reports about mass executions in Poland, communications about the final solution, cables describing the systematic murder of Jews across occupied Europe. Fritz later said, "From the first day I found myself in touch with Nazi secrets, I knew I would have to find a way, somehow, to get them out. But how? He couldn't just walk into the American embassy in Berlin. Germany was at war with America. The embassy was closed. He couldn't send information by mail. All mail was censored. He couldn't transmit by radio. The Gestapo monitored all frequencies. He needed a way to physically transport documents out of Germany." In 1943, opportunity arrived. A fellow anti-Nazi in the Foreign Ministry, someone who shared Fritz's contempt for the regime, reassigned him to diplomatic courier duty. Couriers transported sensitive documents between Berlin and German embassies abroad. They travelled with diplomatic immunity. They weren't searched at borders. They had perfect cover for carrying documents. Fritz realized immediately this was his chance. He could smuggle documents to neutral Switzerland. He could make contact with Allied intelligence. He could finally fight back. But first, he had to steal the documents. The thief in the Foreign Ministry. Stealing documents from Nazi Germany's Foreign Ministry required extraordinary care. The building had security protocols designed to prevent exactly what Fritz was attempting. Guard stations at every entrance, sign-in logs tracking who entered which offices, document control systems tracking sensitive files, random Gestapo inspections, Everything was monitored, logged, controlled. Fritz developed a system. He worked late, after most colleagues had left. Working late was normal in wartime. Everyone worked long hours. Nobody questioned Fritz staying until 10 or 11 p.m. Alone in his office, Fritz would retrieve documents from Ritter's files, cables marked Geheime Reichssache, secret state matter, the highest classification short of eyes only. These documents described German military deployments on the Eastern Front, diplomatic communications with Japan, intelligence assessments from German agents worldwide, economic reports on tungsten shipments from Spain, technical details about V1 and V2 weapons development, reports on industrial production in occupied territories, everything that mattered. Fritz couldn't simply pocket these documents. They were numbered, logged, tracked. Each classified document had a control number written on the cover page. A registry clerk maintained logs showing which documents were stored where. If one disappeared, an investigation would follow immediately. The Gestapo would interview everyone who had access. They'd search offices, homes, belongings. They'd use torture to extract confessions. So Fritz had to be invisible, had to leave no trace, had to return every document to exactly where he found it. Photography became his primary method. He acquired a Leica camera, a German-made precision instrument, common enough not to raise suspicion. Foreign ministry officials sometimes photographed documents for legitimate archival purposes. Having a camera wasn't unusual. Fritz set up a makeshift photo studio in his office after hours, a desk lamp positioned to provide even lighting. The camera mounted on a small tripod for stability. Even slight movement would blur the text. Each document laid flat on his desk. He'd photograph page by page. The technical challenge was significant. Classified documents often used thin paper, easy to fold and transport, but translucent. Light would shine through, making text on both sides visible simultaneously. This created a blurred, unreadable photograph. Fritz solved this by placing a black cloth beneath each page. The cloth absorbed light, preventing transparency effects. Each page required careful positioning. The entire document had to fit in frame. Text had to be level. Even a slight angle made reading difficult. Margins had to be visible. Cropping off edges might eliminate crucial information. Focus had to be perfect. Blurred text was worthless. Lighting had to be consistent. Shadows obscured words. One document might have 15 pages, 15 separate photographs, 15 opportunities for error. Fritz worked slowly, methodically, 15 minutes per document minimum. Complex documents with maps or diagrams took longer, sometimes 30 minutes for a single file. He'd work from 8 p.m. until midnight. 4 hours of photography, perhaps 20 documents photographed in an evening. Then he'd carefully return every document to its proper place in the filing cabinets. Same orientation, same position. Registry clerks had photographic memories. They'd notice if folders were out of order. After returning the documents, Fritz would leave the building, walk home through blackout-darkened Berlin streets, his pockets containing rolls of exposed film showing Nazi Germany's deepest secrets. At home, he'd develop the film in his bathroom, not immediately. Too risky. He'd wait days or weeks, accumulating multiple rolls before developing them all at once. Development required chemicals. Develop a solution, stop bath, fixer. These were available at photography shops. Fritz bought small quantities from different shops, so no one supplier would notice unusual purchasing patterns. His bathroom became a dark room. Towels stuffed under the door to block light, red safe light allowing him to work without exposing the film. He'd develop the negatives, then make prints. each negative printed onto photographic paper, each print showing one page of a classified document. The prints were small. He used the smallest paper size to save space and reduce bulk. But the text remained legible when examined with a magnifying glass. After developing and printing, Fritz had to hide everything: the negatives, the prints, the chemicals. His apartment became a maze of hiding places, negatives stored in sealed containers hidden behind loose bricks in the walls, prints concealed under floorboards, chemicals in unmarked bottles in the kitchen, labelled as cleaning supplies. If the Gestapo searched his apartment, one hidden photograph would be a death sentence. But Fritz bet on probability. He wasn't suspicious, wasn't flagged, wasn't worth investigating. The Gestapo had bigger targets: suspected resistance members, black market operators, people who'd been denounced by neighbours. A quiet foreign ministry clerk who worked late wasn't interesting. Still, Fritz lived with constant fear. Every knock on the door might be the Gestapo. Every unexpected visitor might be an investigator. Every phone call might be a summons to questioning. He couldn't tell anyone what he was doing, couldn't share the burden, couldn't seek reassurance. His wife Anita knew nothing. Their marriage was strained. They lived separately by the early 1940s. Fritz told her he was working late on foreign ministry business. Technically true. Just not the business she imagined. When documents couldn't be photographed, security too tight, time too limited, risk too high, Fritz used alternative methods. Handwritten transcription was slower but safer. He'd spend evenings copying cable text word for word into notebooks. His handwriting was tiny, cramped, efficient, maximizing text per page. A 10-page document might become 3 pages of handwritten notes. The notes were never complete verbatim copies. Fritz focused on critical information: names, dates, numbers, decisions. He'd summarize background material but copy crucial details exactly. These handwritten notes were then transferred to microfilm. Microfilm technology had advanced significantly by the 1940s. A full page of text could be reduced to a tiny frame smaller than a postage stamp. Fritz had access to a microfilm camera through Foreign Ministry Records Department. He'd microfilm his handwritten notes, claiming he was preserving important correspondence. The resulting microfilm strips were easily concealed, rolled up and hidden in fountain pen barrels, inserted into hollowed-out pencils, sewn into the lining of his jackets, slipped into the heels of his shoes. The most valuable method was collecting carbon copies. When foreign ministry typists prepared documents, they used carbon paper to create duplicates. Original, filed in official records. First carbon copy, sent to the relevant department. Second carbon copy, supposed to be destroyed. But wartime bureaucracy was chaotic. Destruction protocols weren't always followed. Second carbon copies ended up in trash bins, or in pending destruction boxes that weren't processed for weeks, or misfiled in storage cabinets. Fritz salvaged these orphaned carbon copies. They were authentic documents, same paper, same typeface, same content as the originals, but officially they didn't exist. Nobody tracked them. Nobody logged them. If they vanished, nobody noticed. Fritz would take carbon copies home in his briefcase, mix them with his personal papers, letters, bills, receipts. If questioned, he'd claim he accidentally picked up office papers with his personal items. A plausible mistake, not suspicious. These carbon copies were perfect intelligence. They didn't require photographing. They were already documents. They didn't require transcription. They were already text. They just required smuggling to Switzerland. The intelligence Fritz provided was extraordinarily diverse. Military intelligence, German troop deployments on the Eastern Front, which divisions were where, their strength, their morale, Luftwaffe losses in bombing campaigns, exact numbers of aircraft destroyed, pilots killed, Wehrmacht fuel shortages, how many tanks were immobilized due to lack of gasoline, naval operations, U-boat deployments, convoy attack plans, diplomatic intelligence, communications between Berlin and Tokyo, showing coordination between Germany and Japan, messages from German embassies in neutral countries, revealing which officials in Spain, Turkey, Sweden were cooperating with Germany, Vatican communications, discussions about possible peace negotiations, Swiss banking information, how Germany was using Swiss banks to move money, economic intelligence, tungsten shipments from Spain, critical for armor-piercing ammunition production, oil supplies from Romania, Germany's primary petroleum source, industrial production statistics, how many tanks, aircraft, weapons Germany was producing monthly, forced labour deployment, how many workers from occupied territories were being used in German factories, Holocaust intelligence, reports on deportations from Hungary, precise numbers, destinations, timelines, cables describing special actions in Poland, Nazi euphemism for mass executions, statistics on concentration camp populations, demonstrating the scale of the genocide, technical intelligence, V-1 flying bomb development, specifications, production locations, deployment plans, V-2 rocket program, test results, manufacturing facilities, targeting priorities, jet aircraft development, how far Germany had progressed on Me-262 production. One cable Fritz photographed in November 1943 described Germany's acoustic torpedo program. This was a revolutionary weapon. Torpedoes that homed in on the sound of ship propellers. Allied convoys were losing ships to these torpedoes without understanding why. Fritz's intelligence revealed the technology. Within weeks, Allied navies developed countermeasures. Noisemakers towed behind ships that decoyed the acoustic torpedoes away from actual vessels. Another document Fritz provided exposed Cicero, Eliezer Basner, a spy working in the British embassy in Ankara. Cicero was photographing classified British documents and selling them to German intelligence. The damage was enormous. Germany knew Allied invasion plans, diplomatic strategies, intelligence operations. Fritz's report identified Cicero. British counterintelligence investigated. Cicero was neutralized. The security breach was closed. Fritz's intelligence on V-weapon programs was particularly valuable. In early 1944, he provided detailed documents about V-1 launch sites in northern France. Locations, construction status, expected operational dates. Allied bombers targeted these sites immediately, destroyed launch facilities before they became operational, delayed the V-1 campaign by months. Every month of delay meant thousands of British civilians not killed by V-1 attacks. Fritz also provided economic intelligence that shaped Allied bombing priorities, documents showing which German factories produced critical components, ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, synthetic fuel facilities in Merseburg, aircraft engine factories in Stuttgart. Allied strategic bombing campaign used this intelligence to target bottlenecks in German war production, destroy one ball-bearing plant, and dozens of tank factories have to slow production, destroy one synthetic fuel plant, and the entire Luftwaffe faces fuel shortages. Fritz's intelligence made Allied bombing more effective. Less bombs dropped, more damage inflicted. Perhaps his most valuable contribution was morale intelligence, not technical data or military deployments, but psychological assessments of Nazi leadership. Fritz attended meetings, read correspondence, observed behavior. He could tell OSS which Nazi officials still believed in victory. which ones knew the war was lost, which ones were positioning themselves for post-war survival. This intelligence shaped Allied psychological warfare operations. Propaganda targeted at German military commanders emphasized that they were fighting for a lost cause, that Hitler would sacrifice them to delay the inevitable, that they could save their soldiers' lives by surrendering. Some commanders were swayed, not many. German military culture emphasized obedience, but some. Every German unit that surrendered without fighting saved Allied lives, and some of those surrenders happened because Allied psychological operations used intelligence Fritz provided about German morale. By war's end, Fritz had delivered 1,600 documents total, 186 in his first delivery to Alan Dulles, approximately 150 documents per courier trip to Bern, 12 trips over 2 years, documents covering German military strategy, economic production, diplomatic communications, technical weapons development, Holocaust operations, leadership morale, intelligence about Japan, information about neutral countries. Assessment. According to Richard Helms, CIA director, Fritz's intelligence was the very best produced by any Allied agent in World War II. According to Dwight Eisenhower, one of the most valuable agents we had during the entire war. According to British intelligence assessment in June 1944, the prize intelligence source of the war, all from a man who never fired a weapon, never planted a bomb, never sabotaged equipment. He just photographed documents and had the courage to commit treason against evil. Fritz accumulated documents over weeks, photocopies, carbons, handwritten transcriptions, microfilm, all hidden in his apartment. Under floorboards, behind books, in hollowed-out containers. If the Gestapo raided his apartment, he'd be executed within hours. But they never did. Fritz was too careful, too boring. A mid-level bureaucrat who worked late and kept to himself. Not suspicious, not interesting. Exactly what he needed to be. When Fritz received courier assignments to Bern, he'd pack the documents carefully. The packing process took hours. Each courier trip was a calculated risk. If he was searched despite diplomatic immunity, he'd be executed. If documents were discovered, everyone he'd worked with would be arrested. His network of sympathizers in the foreign ministry, the 20 or so people who helped him access files, would all die. So Fritz packed with obsessive care. Some documents went in his diplomatic pouch. The pouch itself was protected by diplomatic immunity. Foreign governments weren't supposed to open it, but weren't supposed to, and wouldn't, were different things. If German border guards became suspicious, they might search the pouch and claim it was a security matter. So Fritz placed the stolen documents carefully within the legitimate diplomatic correspondence. A photocopied cable buried between routine consular reports, a carbon copy slipped into a stack of visa applications, microfilm hidden in the binding of an official folder, everything positioned so that casual inspection wouldn't reveal anything suspicious. Other documents he carried on his person, some in his clothing, sewn into jacket linings by his third wife, Maria. Maria helped him without knowing exactly what she was helping with. Fritz told her he was carrying sensitive materials that needed protection. She assumed it was legitimate foreign ministry work. She didn't ask questions. In wartime Germany, not asking questions was survival strategy. She'd sew hidden pockets into his jacket linings, double-layered fabric with thin sheets of microfilm pressed between. From outside, the jacket looked normal. Even if someone patted him down, they wouldn't feel the microfilm. Too thin, too flat. Only a thorough search with the jacket removed and lining examined would reveal the hidden documents. Some documents were concealed in hollowed objects. Fritz carved out the interiors of pencils, inserted rolled microfilm, sealed them with glue and wood shavings. He hollowed out the heels of his shoes, placed documents inside, re-glued the heels. He created false bottoms in his briefcase, a space just thick enough for folded papers. Every hiding place was designed to survive casual inspection. None would survive professional search by Gestapo experts. But Fritz gambled that diplomatic immunity would prevent such searches. And for 2 years, the gamble paid off. The train journey from Berlin to Bern took approximately 10 hours. 10 hours of nerve-wracking tension. Fritz would sit in his compartment, trying to appear relaxed, reading a book, reviewing legitimate foreign ministry paperwork, looking like every other bureaucrat on official business. Inside, his heart raced. Every stop, he feared Gestapo boarding the train. Every conductor who checked tickets might be an informant. Every passenger who glanced at him might be surveillance. The Swiss border crossing at Basel was the most dangerous moment. German border guards checked passports and travel documents. Swiss border guards did the same from their side. Fritz had legitimate credentials, official foreign ministry travel orders, diplomatic passport, but if the guards suspected something, if they decided to search despite diplomatic immunity, if someone had tipped them off, Fritz crossed that border dozens of times. Each time he expected to be arrested. Each time the guards waved him through. Purpose of travel? Diplomatic courier for the foreign ministry. Duration of stay? 2 days. Proceed. Once in Switzerland, Fritz had limited time. He'd arrive in Bern in the evening, meet with Gerald Meyer, his OSS handler, that night or early next morning. Hand over the documents. Meyer would photograph them immediately, every page, every document. The photographing took hours. Fritz would wait, watching Meyer work, knowing that back in Berlin he was already risking discovery. If someone at the foreign ministry needed a document he'd photographed, and that document was missing from the files, if a registry clerk noticed files out of order, if a colleague saw him working late one time too many. After Meyer finished photographing, Fritz would take back the original documents. He couldn't leave them with OSS. They had to return to Berlin, had to be filed back in their proper places. Everything had to look normal. So Fritz would pack the originals carefully, exactly as he'd brought them. Then he'd spend his remaining time in Bern trying to relax, walking through the city, sitting in cafes, trying to forget that he was committing capital treason, trying not to think about what would happen if he was caught. The Gestapo's torture methods were well documented. They'd start with beatings, progress to more sophisticated techniques, water torture, electric shocks, bone breaking. They'd torture him until he revealed everyone who'd helped him, every name, every contact, every sympathizer. Then they'd arrest all those people and torture them too. The thought haunted Fritz. Not fear for himself, he'd accepted that risk, but fear for the others. The clerks who'd looked the other way when he accessed files after hours. The typists who'd accidentally left carbon copies in accessible locations. The colleagues who'd silently supported his quiet resistance. If Fritz was caught, they'd all die. So he was obsessively careful, never took unnecessary risks, never became complacent, never assumed he was safe. The return journey to Berlin was equally tense, carrying the documents back, crossing the Swiss border into Germany, German border guards checking his passport. Anything to declare? No. Purpose of visit to Switzerland? Diplomatic courier service. Welcome back to the Reich. Fritz would return to Berlin exhausted, mentally drained from constant vigilance, but he couldn't rest. First, he had to return all documents to their proper files. This had to happen immediately, before anyone noticed they were missing. Fritz would go directly to the Foreign Ministry from the train station, enter the building, go to his office, retrieve documents from their hiding places, return them to the exact filing locations, same folders, same orientation, same position in the stack. Only after everything was back in place could Fritz allow himself to relax, go home, sleep, prepare for the next theft, the next photography session, the next courier trip. The psychological toll was enormous, living a double life, pretending to serve the regime he was betraying, never able to tell anyone what he was really doing, never able to seek support or reassurance, knowing that one mistake meant death, not a quick death. Torture first, prolonged, agonizing torture designed to extract every piece of information, then execution, probably by guillotine. The Nazis used guillotines for traitors, considered it more humiliating than firing squad. Fritz thought about this often, imagined being discovered, arrested, tortured, imagined dying knowing he'd failed. But he also thought about the alternative, doing nothing, staying silent while genocide continued, following orders while millions died, being complicit through inaction. That was worse than death. So Fritz continued stealing documents, continued risking his life, continued believing that individual conscience mattered more than self-preservation. The strain showed physically. Fritz was a fitness enthusiast, had been since his youth in the Wandervogel movement. He ran regularly, did calisthenics, maintained rigid physical discipline. This was partly health consciousness, partly stress relief. Exercise helped manage the constant tension. But it was also preparation. Fritz believed he might need to run, might need to flee suddenly if discovery threatened. Needed to be physically capable of escape. He never had to run, but he stayed ready, stayed fit, stayed prepared for the moment when his luck might run out. The close calls were terrifying. In spring 1944, there was a security review at the Foreign Ministry. The Gestapo conducted random interviews with staff members, asked about their work, their colleagues, their observations, looking for inconsistencies, suspicious behavior, signs of resistance. Fritz was interviewed, sat across from a Gestapo officer who asked routine questions. Have you noticed any unusual behavior by colleagues? No. Has anyone expressed doubts about the war effort? No. Have you observed any security breaches? No. The interview lasted 20 minutes. Fritz answered every question calmly, directly, showed no nervousness, no hesitation. Behaved exactly like a loyal bureaucrat with nothing to hide. The Gestapo officer thanked him and moved on to the next interview. Fritz left the building and walked 3 blocks before allowing himself to shake. That close, that easily, his espionage could have been discovered. One suspicious answer, one nervous gesture, one inconsistency, and the investigation would have begun. After the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, security became even tighter. The Gestapo conducted mass arrests of anyone connected to the conspirators, tortured thousands, executed hundreds. Fritz expected to be caught in the dragnet, expected that someone under torture would mention his name, expected the midnight knock on the door. It never came. Again, he was too boring to suspect. Too low-level to be involved in assassination plots, too invisible to attract attention. His ordinariness was his best protection. The Gestapo was looking for generals, aristocrats, high-ranking officials, not mid-level clerks. Fritz's final courier trip to Bern was in January 1945. By then, the war was clearly lost. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, American and British forces from the west. German cities were in ruins from Allied bombing. The Nazi government was collapsing. Fritz delivered his last batch of documents to Gerald Mayer. They discussed what would happen when Germany surrendered. "Will I be safe?" Fritz asked. Mayer assured him, "The Americans will protect you. You've provided invaluable intelligence. You'll be recognized as a hero." Fritz wasn't sure he believed it, but he had no choice. He'd committed himself, burned his bridges, made himself a traitor in German eyes. His only hope was that history would judge him differently than his countrymen would. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Fritz was in Berlin, waiting to see if he'd survived not just the war, but the peace. The answer would devastate him. Once in Switzerland, he'd meet with Gerald Mayer, his OSS handler. They'd meet in safe houses, hotel rooms, quiet cafes. Fritz would hand over the documents. Mayer would photograph them immediately. Within hours, the photographs would be encrypted and transmitted to OSS headquarters in Washington. Within days, the intelligence would reach President Roosevelt's desk. Fritz never asked for payment, never requested anything except one thing: confirmation that his intelligence was being used. Dulles assured him it was. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park used Fritz's documents to help crack German diplomatic codes. When British codebreakers had partial decrypts, Fritz's complete documents filled the gaps. The synergy was powerful. Signals intelligence and human intelligence reinforcing each other. Roosevelt personally reviewed Fritz's intelligence reports. Churchill was briefed on them. Stalin received summaries through the Allied intelligence sharing network. Fritz Kolbe, the overlooked bureaucrat, the clerk assigned to menial work because he wouldn't join the party, was influencing decisions at the highest levels of Allied command. Inside the Wolf's Lair. Fritz's access expanded beyond Berlin. As a trusted courier, he was sent to Wolf's Lair, Hitler's secret military headquarters in East Prussia. This was the nerve center of Nazi Germany's war effort. Hitler spent most of 1943-1944 there. So did Goering, Goebbels, Keitel, Jodl, the entire Nazi high command. Military briefings happened there. Strategic decisions were made there. It was the most secure facility in the Third Reich. Concrete bunkers, armed SS guards everywhere, multiple security checkpoints. Even high-ranking officials needed special authorization to enter. Fritz entered as a courier, carrying diplomatic pouches for Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister. Nobody questioned him. Couriers were invisible, servants of the bureaucracy, not worth noticing. Fritz observed everything: the layout of the facility, which officers attended which meetings, the mood, increasingly desperate as Allied advances continued. He overheard conversations. Arguments about strategy, discussions about troop withdrawals from the Eastern Front, panicked assessments of Allied air superiority. All of this went into Fritz's reports to Dulles, not just documents, personal observations, character assessments of Nazi leadership, morale analysis. Hitler is increasingly detached from reality, Fritz wrote in one report. His military commanders know the war is lost. They're afraid to tell him. He rages at anyone who suggests strategic withdrawal. He demands counterattacks that are impossible. His staff has learned to simply nod and agree, then do what they think is necessary. This psychological intelligence was as valuable as the documents. Allied commanders needed to understand Hitler's decision-making. They needed to know if he'd accept rational surrender terms or fight to total destruction. Fritz's reports made it clear: Hitler would never surrender. The war would end only with Germany's complete defeat. This intelligence shaped Allied strategy. No point in offering peace terms. No point in hoping for negotiated settlement. The only option was total military victory. At Wolf's Lair, Fritz witnessed the aftermath of the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler. He wasn't present during the bombing. He'd returned to Berlin the week before. But when he returned to Wolf's Lair as courier in August, the paranoia was palpable. SS guards everywhere, enhanced security checks, suspicion of everyone. Fritz was terrified his espionage would be discovered in the post-assassination security sweep, but he wasn't. Again, he was too boring to suspect. A clerk, a courier, not someone who would commit treason. The Gestapo rounded up hundreds of suspects, tortured them, executed them. Families of suspects were arrested under Sippenhaft, blood guilt. Children sent to orphanages, their names changed to erase their identity. Fritz watched the purge with horror. These were people who had tried to kill Hitler, tried to end the war, tried to save Germany from destruction, and they were being tortured to death. Fritz redoubled his efforts. If armed revolt couldn't stop Hitler, maybe intelligence could. Maybe giving the Allies every advantage would shorten the war. Every week the war continued. Thousands died. Jewish prisoners in concentration camps, Soviet civilians in occupied territories, German soldiers on hopeless battlefields. Allied soldiers fighting their way across Europe. Fritz couldn't stop the killing directly, but he could help end it faster. So he stole more documents, took more risks, provided more intelligence. The skeptics. Not everyone believed Fritz Kolbe was genuine. British intelligence remained convinced he was a German plant. Lieutenant Colonel Claude Dancy, deputy director of MI6, despised Alan Dulles, considered him an amateur, a lawyer playing at espionage. When Dulles sent Fritz's first batch of documents to Washington and OSS shared them with British intelligence, Danzy's assessment was immediate. Fake. This is obviously a German operation to feed us disinformation, Dancy wrote. The quality is too good. The access is too perfect. No genuine source could provide this material without being detected. The Germans are testing our codes. They'll send us false information mixed with true information. We'll act on the false information, and they'll know we're reading their fake source. Dancy's skepticism infected others. OSS counterintelligence in Washington reviewed Fritz's material with suspicion. Some analysts agreed with Dancy. Others were convinced Fritz was genuine, but worried about the implications. If this source is real, one analyst wrote, then we have a moral obligation to protect him, which means we can't act on some of his intelligence. If we bomb a target he told us about, the Germans will investigate how we learned of it. They might discover him. We'd be signing his death warrant. This created an impossible dilemma. Fritz was risking his life to provide intelligence. But using that intelligence might get him killed. For nearly a year, August 1943 to July 1944, much of Fritz's intelligence wasn't used. It was filed, studied, analysed, but not acted upon. Roosevelt saw the reports. Churchill was briefed, but operational commanders were told to verify the intelligence through other sources before acting. Fritz didn't know this. He kept stealing documents, kept photographing cables, kept risking his life with every courier trip to Bern. Dulles never told him that Washington doubted his authenticity, never told him that British intelligence considered him a fraud. Dulles believed Fritz was genuine, and Dulles kept pushing Washington to use the intelligence. The breakthrough came in early 1944. British code breakers at Bletchley Park were working on German diplomatic codes. They'd achieved partial breaks. They could decrypt some messages, but not all. When they compared their partial decrypts to Fritz's complete documents, everything matched perfectly. The documents Fritz provided were identical to the encrypted messages Britain had intercepted. This was proof. Fritz's documents were genuine. He wasn't a plant. wasn't feeding disinformation. He was providing actual Nazi government communications. British intelligence reversed its assessment. In June 1944, MI6 informed Washington, "This source is authentic. His material is the highest quality intelligence we've received from inside Germany. Recommend full utilization of all information provided." Roosevelt was briefed. The assessment, Fritz Kolbe was the prize intelligence source of the war. Finally, his intelligence was being used. Allied bombing raids targeted facilities Fritz had identified. Diplomatic initiatives were planned around information from his cables. Military operations incorporated his assessments of German capabilities. In January 1944, Roosevelt informed Churchill about German intelligence penetration of British-Turkish diplomatic communications. Source: Fritz Kolbe. In spring 1944, Allied commanders learned exact details of Luftwaffe losses in bombing raids on London. Source: Fritz Kolbe. In summer 1944, Allied intelligence discovered locations of V-1 and V-2 production facilities. Source: Fritz Kolbe. By late 1944, Fritz had delivered over 1,600 classified documents, intelligence that was shaping Allied strategy, intelligence that was shortening the war, all stolen from desks in the Foreign Ministry, all smuggled to Switzerland in diplomatic pouches, all provided by a man who never asked for payment, never requested asylum, never wanted anything except to help destroy the government he served. Resolution: The Traitor, May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. Fritz Kolbe survived. He'd committed treason for 2 years, stolen over 1,600 classified documents, smuggled them to enemy intelligence, provided information that helped defeat his own country. And he'd never been caught. The Gestapo never suspected him. The SS never investigated him. His colleagues never reported him. He was too boring, too invisible, too perfect in his ordinariness. After the surrender, Fritz thought he'd be celebrated, thought Germany would recognize that he'd opposed the Nazis, thought his countrymen would understand he'd tried to save Germany from Hitler's destruction. He was wrong. Post-war Germany despised him. He wasn't a hero. He was a traitor. It didn't matter that he'd opposed genocide. Didn't matter that he'd tried to shorten the war. Didn't matter that he'd risked his life. He'd betrayed Germany to the enemy. That was unforgivable. Fritz tried to return to the Foreign Office in 1951. His application was rejected. Too controversial. Too divisive. The new West German government didn't want to employ someone who'd committed espionage against the previous German government, even if that previous government was Nazi. Fritz tried to settle in the United States. Surely America would welcome the man who'd been their best source, but immigration authorities denied his application. No suitable work available, no compelling reason to grant residency. The OSS had disbanded. The CIA that replaced it had new priorities. Fritz Kolbe was yesterday's news. He ended up working as a sales representative for an American power saw manufacturer. The man who'd influenced Roosevelt and Churchill sold power tools. He lived in obscurity. Few knew what he'd done. Those who knew didn't care. In Germany, he was shunned. Former foreign ministry colleagues refused to speak to him. Friends from before the war avoided him. He was a pariah. Der Stern magazine later wrote, "Kolbe's story demonstrates that ordinary Germans could do something to fight Hitler's madness, and post-war Germany treated him like a leper because of his actions." Fritz Kolbe died of gallbladder cancer on February 16, 1971, in Bern, Switzerland. He was 70 years old. His obituary was small. Most Germans had never heard of him. Allen Dulles, by contrast, became director of the CIA, celebrated as America's spy master. His reputation partly built on his recruitment of Fritz Kolbe. In his memoirs, Dulles wrote, "George Wood was not only our best source on Germany, but undoubtedly one of the best secret agents any intelligence service has ever had. But when Fritz died, Dulles didn't attend the funeral, didn't issue a public statement. Fritz Kolbe remained unknown for decades. The intelligence files were classified until 1996. When researchers finally accessed the documents, they discovered the extraordinary story. A mid-level bureaucrat who'd provided 1,600 classified documents, who'd risked his life repeatedly, who'd influenced Allied strategy at the highest levels, who'd never been paid, never asked for anything, never wanted recognition, who did it simply because genocide and tyranny offended his conscience. In 2003, journalist Lucas Delattre published a biography, A Spy at the Heart of the Third Reich. Finally, Fritz's story became public. In 2004, the German Foreign Office officially recognized his service. They dedicated a room to him in the Ministry building in Berlin, the Fritz Kolbe Room. A small plaque, a quiet acknowledgement, 60 years too late. Richard Helms, former CIA director, wrote, "Kolbe's information is now recognized as the very best produced by any Allied agent in World War II. Dwight Eisenhower called him one of the most valuable agents we had during the entire war." But these assessments came after Fritz's death. He never knew. Never received the recognition while alive. Never heard his contributions acknowledged publicly. He died thinking history had forgotten him, thinking his country still considered him a traitor, thinking his sacrifices meant nothing. The cruel irony, Fritz Kolbe proved that ordinary Germans could resist, could fight the Nazi regime from within, could make a difference. But post-war Germany didn't want to hear that message, because acknowledging Fritz meant acknowledging that resistance was possible. And if resistance was possible, why didn't more Germans resist? That question was too uncomfortable. So Germany ignored Fritz Kolbe, shunned him, let him die in obscurity. It was easier than confronting what his courage said about their cowardice. Fritz understood this. In 1945, he wrote, "My aim was to help shorten the war for my unfortunate countrymen, and to help concentration camp inmates avoid further suffering. Not to be a hero, not to be celebrated, just to do what conscience demanded." The spy who infiltrated the Nazi foreign ministry, who walked into the wolf's lair, who survived 2 years of espionage in a police state, who provided intelligence that shaped Allied strategy, who helped end World War II faster, and who died knowing his countrymen considered him a traitor. Fritz Kolbe's story asks an uncomfortable question. What is treason? Is it betraying your country, or is it betraying humanity? Fritz chose humanity. He looked at the Holocaust, at the war of aggression, at the systematic murder of millions, and he decided that loyalty to a criminal regime was itself a crime. He committed treason against Nazi Germany, but he was loyal to something higher, the belief that some things matter more than nationalism, that genocide must be opposed, that tyranny must be resisted, that individual conscience must not be silenced. He paid for that belief with decades of isolation, but he never regretted his choice. When asked after the war if he'd do it again, Fritz's answer was immediate. Yes, without hesitation, every single day. That's the mark of a genuine spy, not someone seeking adventure or payment, but someone who saw evil and refused to be complicit. Fritz Kolbe infiltrated the heart of Nazi Germany, not with guns or bombs, but with a camera, a diplomatic pouch, and an unbreakable conscience. He survived, and in surviving he proved something important. Even in a totalitarian state, even under the Gestapo's surveillance, even facing execution if discovered, resistance is possible. One person can make a difference. One person with access and courage can change history. Fritz Kolbe was that person. The spy the Nazis never suspected. The source the Allies didn't initially believe. The hero his country refused to acknowledge. But history remembers, and history's judgment is clear. Fritz Kolbe was on the right side, not the German side, not the Allied side, the human side, the side that says genocide is wrong, tyranny must be opposed, and conscience matters more than orders. That's why his story matters, not because he was German or American, but because he was human, and he chose humanity over nationalism. In a war defined by nationalist hatred, that choice was revolutionary. In a world that still struggles with questions of loyalty and conscience, that choice remains relevant. Fritz Kolbe showed that the most dangerous weapon against tyranny isn't military force, it's individual conscience, the willingness to say no, the courage to resist, the determination to fight even when fighting means betraying the very institutions you're part of. That's the spy who infiltrated the SS. That's the man who survived. That's the hero history almost forgot. Fritz Kolbe, codename George Wood, Germany's traitor, humanity's champion, humanity's champion, humanity's champion, humanity's champion, humanity's champion, humanity's champion, humanity's champion.